Okay, we're rolling. I'm back in plenary session, video edition, joined by Dr. Jeffrey Flier. Jeff Flier is a former dean of Harvard Medical School, and he is someone who I've had the good fortune to chat with quite a bit over the last year and a half. Dr. Flier, it's a pleasure to have you here on the podcast. Thanks for doing this.
My pleasure to join you.
So I wanted to, I don't know, there's so many things I wanted to talk to you about, and particularly your time as the dean of Harvard Medical School, and also about the culture of science in the moment. But I wonder if you might start back in the beginning. I wonder if we might take listeners through a little snapshots, highlights of your career. Um, I guess the first thing I wanted to mention was you did your medical school in Sinai in New York City. You stayed on to do your residency there. Um, I wonder if you might talk about what it was like to be a student in New York City back when you trained. What was that experience like?
Oh, well, I was born and raised in New York, and just to go back 2 layers,
Yeah,
I went to the public schools. I was at the Bronx High School of Science,
I
which was
see.
one of the
Yeah.
I always say the smartest people I ever knew up until today were my classmates at Bronx Science High School. Uh, I went to City College of New York with a tuition of $37 per semester.
$37.
And
Wow.
yeah, and but it was a great education, very smart people at that point. Everything was, they used to call it the proletarian Harvard.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
and
It's still a great place. Still a great place, City College.
Yeah, it is. But it's a little different from the way it was then. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's still a good place. And I decide between medicine and law, and I decided on medicine, and I applied to a variety of places. I wasn't at the absolute top of my class, so it seemed like about a quarter of all the students I knew at City College wanted to be doctors. So it was a very competitive
Hmm.
situation.
Hmm.
And I got into a bunch of schools, and the one that I decided to go to was Mount Sinai, which at that point it was the first inaugural entering class. And I found that very exciting to be in a class of 36 people who would be kind of historically the first.
And what year was
And
this that you matriculated? What year did you start?
uh, I started in 68
68.
and
Wow.
graduated in 72. You
Wow.
were not born then.
I wasn't. But
Right.
what did I mean, what a year to start. I mean, 68 was quite an eventful year.
Yeah, so it was a politically fraught year. The Vietnam War was going on. There was a lot of campus politics. There were a bunch of kids in my class of 36 who were very active in campus politics when they were in college. So the whole thing was it was on one level a political environment.
Yes.
On another level, I was in a group that just was thrilled to be in the first class. I can remember the first lecture, the second lecture, the third lecture, and they had collected a group of really smart, like department chairs, to be the foundational department chairs, and they were amazing people.
Hmm.
And the thing that was particularly, let's say, formative for me was that for some reason that was, I think, quasi random, the people who were leading the school in the various departments had a strong interest in diabetes.
Mm,
And, strangely enough, I became a diabetes specialist.
I see.
So I sort of I treated these as heroic people. Some
Yeah.
of them were.
Yeah.
And I did a little research in medical school,
Yeah.
in immunology, uh, but decided I wanted to be an endocrinologist
Yeah.
and be doing research if I could in diabetes.
I see. And were
And
you,
but
is your family a medical family? Did you come from
No,
doctor? No.
no, no, no. My father did not go to college.
Hmm.
He was a pilot in World War II and came back and joined the business of my mother's family, which
I
is a
see.
fur business. And my grandparents were all Russian immigrants without any education. So there were no doctors in my immediate family.
I see. You stayed on at Sinai to do your residency, and then you went to the National Institutes of Health. So this must have been in the late 1970s at NIH.
Well, actually, it was in the early
Early
1970s or
1970s. Okay.
mid 1970s. So
Mid
I
19.
I
Okay.
finished my residency in 74,
Okay.
but I applied to go to NIH while I was a junior medical student because we were all aware the war was going on. They were drafting doctors.
I see.
I didn't have a good number in the draft lottery,
Right.
and everyone sort of knew that the best thing you could possibly do if you wanted to not be drafted was to go to NIH for further training. It was a highly competitive program. I applied. Um, and when I graduated, I was considered, number one in the class. So I had a good standing, and I applied to many groups at NIH. It was a match, just like the residency match is today. And
Hmm.
my number one choice was the group that I got accepted into, which was the diabetes branch at
I
NIH.
see. Hmm.
And as part of the whole deal for my particular program, I did an endocrine fellowship as well as research
In diabetes. And
in
was it the
diabetes.
NIDDK back then, or did it have a different nomenclature?
It was not the NIDDK. It was the National Institute of Diabetes and Metabolic Disease.
Wow.
I'm
Okay.
pretty sure. Yeah, and
Yeah.
then I think the kidney part or the digestive disease part got thrown in later.
Yes.
Anyway, it had a different name.
They engulfed it. So I want to ask you this. I know a bit about the oncology history in the 1970s, and it was a very eventful time. I mean, the advances that were made in that decade are still carry forth to this day. What was it like in endocrinology and diabetes? Was it an exciting time for you? Was it an exciting place to be?
Oh, it was unimaginably exciting because at that particular point in time, it was in the curve was just taking off for molecular understanding of endocrinology.
Hmm.
And the group that I was in, the diabetes branch, its expertise it really was the foundational lab in figuring out how hormones like insulin work, that they bound to molecules on the membrane of cells that they called receptors. No one had identified a receptor. And what the group was doing, it was defining techniques for saying this is a receptor. It binds to
Okay.
a highly labeled hormone in a reversible manner, and it has these certain kinetics, and that's the lab into which I came that was doing that, and it was famous around the world at that point. And then in the broader endocrine community, it was just many of the great names of endocrinology of that era were there.
Mm.
So it was extremely exciting, um, with the one exception that when I started out in my lab effort, nothing was working for about 9 months. And I
Uh-huh.
was actually, and other people's projects were going great. So I was beginning to think that maybe this was going to be, a short phase. Then I'd go back and be a clinical endocrinologist.
Uh-huh.
And then I had a good idea. I was able to carry out the idea. It worked. I had a little bit of mini fame there, and suddenly all these places wanted to hire me to be an assistant professor
I see.
in endocrinology, and that's what happened.
And that's how you went to the House of God. You were on the Harvard faculty, and you're the Beth Israel Deaconess, and you were there. Your career was there, and you worked your way up the ladder. Um, you were there a long
Yeah, I
time.
went there in 78 as
78.
an assistant professor, and I was the head of a diabetes unit, and
Yes.
I was the diabetes unit. There was no one else. It was
You're the head of
me.
yourself.
I
Right.
was, yeah,
Exactly.
I
Yeah.
was in
Yeah.
charge of
Yeah.
myself. A
Yeah.
lot of people said, "Why would you do that?" Because right across the street is the Joslin Diabetes Center. I said, "Yeah,
Mhm.
but they're a different organization. They're not part of us. We have a hospital. You have a hospital." So, and it worked.
Yeah.
I built a group, and it eventually went on to be quite a big group of other faculty. And then I became the head of the endocrine division, which was the larger thing. And then I went on to do other things.
Now I'm wondering, what was the culture like in academic medicine at that time? I mean, you strike me as a hard worker, but was it the kind of job where you were there all the time? Was it a competitive environment? I mean, what were those years like? 78 to
Yeah,
say 88.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting to think back about it in the context of your question. I mean, it was competitive, not against other people. I didn't see myself competing against any other person doing what I was doing. It was competitive in that you knew that you were going to be successful if you did research that led to papers that got published, that got recognized, which then led you to get grants, which then led you to get good fellows, all of those things. So you
Right.
knew no one was going to or could hand you that.
Right. You're competing against yourself.
You're competing against yourself. And so that is the way that I felt. Now, I had a young family. My wife came up to complete her residency. When I came up to take that job, she had a baby, our older daughter, who's now a doctor at Harvard Medical School. But she was born, shortly after we arrived in Boston. So I had a certain amount of work-life balance. I was not, working 70-hour weeks, but I surely was working 50-hour weeks,
Hmm.
and thought a lot about my activities, my research, when I was home.
When you were doing those first few years, I would imagine, like so many people, I mean, there's some uncertainty. You talk about, what does it take to build up a lab? It's not easy.
Yeah.
Never was easy. Um, but the rhetoric around it, I think, is different today than it once was. I mean, I'm just curious. I mean, did people talk about burnout? Did people talk about those kinds of issues back then, or was it a different mindset? Really? I
Yeah,
mean,
I think it was a different mindset. No one that I remember anyone talking about burnout,
yeah,
although I'm sure some people burned out around me,
right.
but
Sure.
but they weren't talking about it. They were
Yeah,
just doing it.
yeah, they're just doing
And
it.
you know, I think in fairness, there was an easier grant route. Okay, the
Yes. Okay.
grant, the number of people who did what I did was fewer, relatively speaking, than it became as I went along. And so, I got my first grant. I didn't get every grant that I ever applied for, but I got most of them. And at various couple of different points, I also was able to get some biopharmaceutical support
Sure.
at a couple of points. That was very helpful to expand my efforts, and it was so. Um, yeah, things have changed.
I was reading online that you were pointing out that in your lab many years ago, you pushed the industry to pursue drugging of SGLT2. Um,
Well, that's not exactly correct.
Okay.
I mean, there was no SGLT2.
Okay.
So the short story on that was
Yeah.
that I co-founded a biotech company
Uh-huh.
in about 1988 with a couple of friends of mine at Harvard, and we had some good ideas, and we spoke with someone who spoke to someone, and before we knew it, there was this little company that was part of another biotech, but it was kind of semi-independent,
Yeah.
and we had great ideas, uh, and to get to the end of the story, none of them came to anything.
I see.
But in retrospect, when we look at it, all of them should have come to something.
I see.
But in fact, the money was cut off before the projects got to where they needed to go. And none of us wanted to leave academia to pursue these, as our main career. We could have,
Sure.
but we didn't. But the one that you're talking about is I mean, if you weird story, but since the SGLT2 inhibitors are now a big thing, they have all
Right.
these beneficial effects that weren't anticipated.
Right.
So we were at a phase where, we needed as founders to come up with some additional new ideas, we were told. So I did some thinking and came up with the idea that based on some physiology that was being done, if you could inhibit the absorption of glucose by the kidney, so it would be peed out rather than reabsorbed, you could actually have a highly effective diabetes treatment. And I
Sure.
made a
Okay.
presentation to explain why this
Mhm.
would be. And the reason I was particularly interested in, I had just done a sabbatical year at MIT in the lab that had cloned the first glucose transporter. At
I
that
see.
time, they thought it was the only glucose transporter.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
Now there's 8 or 9.
Yes.
But I said, hey, we have the technology. Let's clone the one that's in the kidney. Then we can inhibit it, and then we can have a diabetes treatment. And I was very excited about it. But all my friends and colleagues around the table looked at me and said, nah, that's not a good project. And it took it now 20 years for
Right.
those drugs to come out, but they're amazingly good.
They're amazingly good. Yes. I was just seeing overall survival benefits here, there, everywhere. It looks terrific.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
so I want to ask you this question. You know, when I read about you, 20 years is compressed into one line, as so often is the case. But
yeah.
you were right. You're the chief of endocrinology. You were the vice chair of medicine. You were the chief administrative officer for academics at the Bethesda Deaconess, and eventually they tapped you to be dean. Um, I wonder if you might tell us. I don't know if you've thought about this, but you know, it's a combination of things. I've been thinking. I mean, and you tell me if I'm wrong. You'll know better
Yeah.
than me. You know, um, in order to be a really successful academician, to be an academic leader, as you have been, as you are, you have to be really good at your science. You have to be really solid in your clinical skills. I think you have to have this component that people often gloss over, but I mean, there is some element of ambition, the desire to do that, and then I think you have to be some degree a politician. I don't know. How do you think of yourself along? What was it about you? This kid from the Bronx, went to City College, New York, and you ended up the dean of Harvard Medical School. What was it? What is it about you that put you there, or was it chance? What were those things?
Yeah, well, I'll start off saying, of course, there was an element of chance, which,
Okay.
I can't quantitate, but I can just put it in context in that, you know, I never thought of myself as a particularly ambitious person. On the other hand, I kind of was self-confident. I thought I could do things, and if I could do them, I should do them. So when different opportunities came, head of the endocrine division, or should we get a new person? I said, oh, wait a minute, and I'm glad that I did that. And then the hospital changed over in its chair of medicine, and I was discussing with our new chair, and he said, well, what do you think is something that we need here? I said,
Mhm.
well, there's really no one who oversees research in this very big research, heavy department. He says, oh,
Right.
would you like to do that? I said, okay, I did that. Then the hospital got into some financial trouble in the early 90s. And there were reasons to think someone needed to look at the whole academic mission. And there was a new president who was hired. And I had known him a little bit because he used to be at Harvard Medical School. And he said, Jeff, what do you think we need? I mean, these things literally happen. And I
Right.
said, well, you know, Gene Braunwald at the Partners Institution, he's called the chief academic officer. I said, I could do that here. He says, write your description. So that's how I got to
I see.
those jobs.
Yes. Okay.
And then I had been, I had been asked by different search firms to look at different dean jobs. And I looked at a couple of them, but I was very happy in Boston. My family was happy in Boston. And I did not want to disrupt that for a dean job that didn't look all that, important to me at the time. And then the Harvard dean job came to, being open. And it was also at the transition of the Harvard presidency from going to Drew Faust, who hadn't yet started. They had the usual thing at Harvard. They name an advisory committee to the president to look at candidates. And I knew a couple of people on the committee, but most of them I didn't. And every once in a while, this was between late 2006 to early 2007, I would be hearing on the rumor mill, hey, Jeff, I hear your name is on the list. When it was 100, it was 30, it was 10,
Yeah.
and I said, gee, that's interesting. No one has talked to me. And, and then believe it or not, I think it was in April or May of 2007, the Boston Globe ran an article saying the Harvard Medical School search for their new dean is down to 2 finalists. And they mentioned me as one of the finalists.
I see.
It was bizarre. Yeah.
And you still hadn't
In
heard
the
anything
Boston
about it.
Globe. No, I mean, I didn't hear anything from the president. And then a few days after that, Drew Faust contacted me and said, I'd like to meet with you. I met with her. I won't go through all of the stuff,
Sure.
but she offered me the job. And
But
I
let me
took
ask
it.
you. So, I mean, I don't know. You'd been at Harvard a long time, and so a lot of people probably knew you, and you had a rising administrative roles.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I guess what I don't have a sense of, I mean, you know, I know you one-on-one a little bit over the last year and a half. Um, what is your personality? I mean, it seems like you're an easygoing person. Do you get mad? Um,
Yeah, yeah. Well, okay. So that's kind of an open-ended
uh-huh.
personality question.
Yes.
But what I would say is, because I've thought about it, I haven't really talked about this publicly with anyone, but I think the reputation that I had amongst a lot of colleagues, some of whom knew me well, some of whom didn't know me all that well, but knew me by reputation, was that I was reasonably bright, competent. I cared about other people. I cared about the institution. It wasn't just about me. I had integrity. I was honest. I wasn't a bullshit artist.
Mhm.
Those were the things. And I think that those criteria knocked a lot of other people on the list off.
Of course, of course. In this
It
line of
must
work,
have,
yeah.
right? Yeah. So I was a survivor having those traits.
Yeah.
And, now, do I have strong opinions on things? Absolutely, I do. Do I try to lord it over people with my strong opinions? No. I did. Oh, excuse me. My wife has decided to enter. Please, you
Hey.
can leave now, Terry.
No,
I'm being recorded.
Yes, I'm getting to the
Okay.
stuff.
Thank you.
Great to
We
see
have
you.
a very good relationship.
Of course. Well, both of you are on Twitter and terrific follows. So I
Right,
highly
right.
recommend. Yeah.
So, let's see, where was I here?
You were
I
talking
was
about your
saying,
personality traits. So yeah, go on.
yeah. So, but I can make I can make strong decisions when those are called for. And
Yeah.
I've had to do that a number of times.
Yes.
Like I made a decision to close one department in Harvard
Yes.
Medical School. I made a decision to close research center for a variety of reasons that were very powerful, that required me. But the people who I hired, I worked with very effectively. I would state my opinions. People viewed me as more honest about my views than maybe some other deans who would talk in communication speak. But I felt, to me, there was a line between um, speaking for the institution, which you have to do when you're a dean, and letting people know what you actually think on some issues.
Right.
That was possible to do. It's more difficult to do today with social media, cancel culture, all the rest. So I'm very glad that that's not the position I'm in today.
That's fascinating. Okay. I want to talk to you about one of those small issues of today, because I mean I think I think there is I think you're onto something. You're onto something in the sense that when we meet people face to face, there's nothing that or one of the things that we respect a great deal in the academy are straight shooters. People who tell you what they think, even if you don't agree, if they do it with a smile on their face, and if they are receptive to your point of view as well, you tell them what you think, and they don't immediately demean you or say it's wrong. They say, that's what you think, that's what I think, and here's why. Let's talk it out a little bit. Let's get a cup of coffee. Let's get lunch.
Yeah.
That's what we love,
Yeah.
face to face. But that same interaction, if it's in this impersonal world of online, I think it can be heated. It can escalate. There can be all these malicious actors who pile on. And so I do think you're right. There is something different going on. It's not as healthy as it once was. It's particularly bad in the age of COVID. We can talk about those things. But the thing I wanted to
Yeah.
ask you about a little bit are the portraits. And I don't know if you know I'd be asking about this. But
The portraits.
the
Yes.
portraits. And okay, so I guess I think I follow one of your daughters on Twitter as well, and I think she and I are probably the same generation. We're kind of like-minded on some of these things, but I also see your point as well, and so I'm curious if you want to articulate it. But here's how I would frame the issue. I think as has been in the long arc of human progress, We increasingly have more diverse classes, more women, more minorities, more people like myself whose parents are immigrants who came from India with nothing to this country. We have the face and the people who are in medicine is changing over time. At this,
Absolutely.
yeah, at the same, and that's terrific. And at the same time, medicine is a noble profession, particularly American medicine. I think American medicine in the last 2 centuries is a noble profession. It's a noble profession because it drove the world. American medicine over the last 2 centuries, um, and to some degree in Europe and some degree elsewhere as well, but American medicine led. I mean, we are the people who have set, by we, I mean Americans, we're the ones who set the standards for how do we train people? What does it mean to have scientific medicine? How has medicine transformed itself over the last 2 centuries? And some of the people who've held the very important roles, such as dean or chancellor or section chief or chairman, these happened to be, I think, because of the culture of America at the time, more white men than any other demographic. But they were, people who overcame challenges in their own life. And they were people who I think did contribute. And they contributed to not just their own personal goals, but also to the health of many people who may not look anything like them. And so, at a place like Harvard Medical School, my understanding is that there is some hall that's a very sacred hall. And this hall had a number of portraits on the wall. And those portraits are naturally of the people who held the leadership roles for most of the history of Harvard Medical School. And so it is disproportionately white men. 1,000 years from now, I think it'll look very different. 1,000 years from now, it'll be reflecting the changing demographics in schools. But it is what it is at the moment. The question is arised, should the portraits be left up or should they be taken down? And I think the argument to take them down is the argument that it doesn't feel as inclusive. And I think, I have to commend your family because your daughter and you actually talked about it online publicly. And I think your daughter played that. She argued the other side that it doesn't feel inclusive to those of us who look at that portrait and don't see ourselves in that person. You had a different argument, and I'm wondering if you might articulate and you had an argument, and I guess I would say not only did you have an argument, but I think a lot of people may have held your views, but you had the courage to put pen to paper and you actually came forward with the views. So I wonder if you might
Yeah,
articulate your argument. Yeah.
sure, sure. And so let me give you just the actual history of what happened. Um, because it was quite interesting. First of all, it wasn't Harvard Medical School per se.
Okay.
It was the Brigham and Women's Hospital, their main lecture hall. Okay. That's a hospital that goes back about 100 years, and it's right, across the lane from the administrative building of Harvard Medical School. And I remember when I unsuccessfully applied for an internship at the Brigham. I was taken on a tour of that building, and shown what were then still a lot of portraits. You would put up the portraits of the chairs of departments, the hospital presidents, et cetera. And indeed, they were white men because there's no mystery. That's who were the leaders then, for reasons that we all know were not ideal, but that's what they were. Over the years, I must have given 6 or 7 major lectures in that very spot. And every time I would come, there'd be a few more, portraits hung up to the point where at the very end, the wall space was completely filled.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I was invited, it's about 2 years ago, to give a lecture there to the medical grand rounds before COVID. I actually went there and I walked into the room and I was kind of taken aback. There was nothing on the walls. Mm-hmm. All the portraits were gone. And I think I had heard some rumor to that effect, but I was still taken aback. And I said to somebody in the front, one of the senior professors, what's with the portraits? And they said, oh, we can't talk about it. All right. So I gave my lecture. I didn't say anything about it. And then over the next few days, I decided to write something about it. And I wrote what became an op-ed in the Boston Globe. And the point that I was making, and anyone could get it, you can still get that article online. I don't think I would change a single word of what I wrote, because I did a lot in thinking about it before I wanted to publish it. And I basically said, hey, folks, medicine has changed. It used to be all white males. Weren't any Jews. There weren't
Right.
any other kind of grouping other than what we'll call for the moment white males. Many of the white males who were up there were amazingly important physicians and
Yes.
leaders who we respect. We
Yes.
don't. It's not like they were Southern, Revolutionary War generals.
Sure.
These were doctors who were doing good stuff, who we recognize for what they did.
Yes.
And I said that the thing has changed dramatically. Now half of the medical students are women, maybe 51%, more than 49 men. The number of women on the faculty has gone up. The number of underrepresented minorities has gone up, not as fast as people would like, but many reasons that one can give why that has been. It's a subject of discussion. Okay, so what I said was that if your goal is to accommodate the changes, the thing to do is not to take down all of the portraits and leave the walls bare, but you develop an intelligent, thoughtful strategy to take some of them down and replace them with portraits of people who are more diverse. Women, the president of the hospital at the time is a woman, was a woman,
Yes.
and there are important people who are women and minorities in that institution, both physicians and non-physician people who are often not given as much respect with portraits, and they should be put up there. And
Yes.
then put a large plaque as you enter
Yes.
saying, this is what we want you to know about our portraiture. Give a lecture once a year about the changing humanity who represent the Brigham and Women's Hospital. That's what I said.
Yes.
And I did get what I would say were 100 or more, emails from people, including many department chairs at the Brigham, saying, thank you for saying what we felt we could not say, or we did say privately, and that was the end of that. And then
Yeah.
I had some people saying that it was insensitive.
Yeah.
And I understand that they said that and they felt that, but I think that's a mistake of sensitivity as much as it is, a mistake on my part.
If I may articulate what I think the philosophical question is, because I think this is it's a visible symbol of a
Yeah.
philosophical question. And the philosophical question, as I see it, is in a well-intentioned and good effort to celebrate human beings in all of the myriad ways in which we are similar and different. Um,
Mhm.
um, there are two ways you can do that. One is you can take down everyone's portrait, or the other way is you can add more portraits
Yeah,
to the portraits.
exactly.
Yeah, and I guess I can understand why, um, out of frustration or out of a history of a past injustice, one might feel the right answer is to take down the portraits. But the more I think about it, I always come to the feeling that the right answer is to add more portraits. Is the right answer is what you say, and I'll tell you why. You know, I grew up in this country. My dad's an engineer, and he worked in, and we always lived in towns where I think I'm the only Indian face in the whole town.
Mhm.
I think I throughout. I think in high school there were 600 kids in my class, and maybe there was one other Indian guy, but there weren't many. And over the years when I was a student, there were always occasional displays of like all the Pulitzer Prize winners in fiction. Maybe that comes to mind. Actually, it comes to mind
Yeah.
because I'm actually reading a great novel by Philip Roth. Um,
Okay.
a guy from Newark, Jewish writer, American writer, maybe one of the greatest American writers in history.
Right.
And when I looked at that display as a kid, I didn't see, Dr. I didn't see a lot of white faces looking back at me, and I didn't see that I'm an Indian kid. How will I ever fit in there? I always saw myself in those people. I always saw myself in the sense that I saw what happens when you apply yourself to the craft. What happens when you care about eternal human truths? I always saw myself in all these photos, even I look nothing like the person. And I think that, that's part of it. It's that um, yes, the photo should reflect the world as it is and as we want it to be. But at the same time, we should, I think, all see in each other more commonalities. The commonality of being a human struggling and working and trying to make the world better, which, to be honest, probably every single doctor on that wall in their own way, in their own time, product of their times, they couldn't change the world on their own based on what
Right.
they might have wanted. But yet in their own way, they put themselves to the task of making human health better. And so I do admire them. I admire them.
Yeah.
I respect them. I appreciate what they did. And I hope 1,000 years from now, maybe somebody will look back at us and say that, they admire some things we did too.
Yeah, I could not agree more with your articulation of that. And I would just add the point now, as a educator, is that to promote the view by our more diverse group of students and trainees, to promote the view that you should be looking for someone who looks like you, and if not, you should be hurt and impeded or develop a headache or become depressed. I think that that is a terrible approach to, uh, you know, facilitating the future development of people who I have enormous respect for and expectations for. We want people to be doing just what you did. I mean, I knew when I was growing up, even though in the neighborhood that I was in school I was in, there were a lot of predominantly Jewish kids, but I knew that in many parts of society and academia, there were very few Jews.
Yeah.
And, my goal wasn't to be hurt by that. My goal was to do the best that I could do. And maybe I'll end up somewhere where I wouldn't have been expected to be. So I think that the attitude that you take going into these kinds of encounters with the world is very material for how successful you will be. And what we want is people to be successful, not to be hurt and damaged and unwilling to look at a speaker in a room because of the fact that the people up on the walls were mainly white men. So, but
I want to expand on that thesis a little bit because it really hits close to home, which is, when I started out, I was a, Indian kid going to oncology, but of course there's some Indian men, people have broken that path before me, but I
yeah,
was also somebody interested. I mean, not about race or gender or anything. I was interested in doing something fundamentally different than what I had seen oncologists model. I want to do health policy. I
yep,
wanted to
yep,
do evidence-based medicine. I wanted to do like type of research that there was nobody ahead. I mean, there may have been a couple of people. I don't want to overstate the claim, but there
yeah,
were not clear role models for me. And I want to tell the people, the young people who listen, I want to tell them, if you look up at something or you look in a direction and there is no one who is like you doing that, you do that. You push your way
exactly.
through it. You do that. You fight for it. You do it. And you know what? It may not be easy. I mean, I think when you're in the arena that you and I are in, the arena of ideas, people will insult you. They'll call you names. They'll push
Yeah,
back on you. They'll tell you you're wrong. They're stupid. You shouldn't talk. You're not qualified. You got to
yeah,
just put your nose down and keep doing it. And when you do it for 15 years, when you do it for that kind of time, walls will break. And what I want is, I mean, I think what we both want is we want to have a youth that is so resilient that they can
yes.
blow through obstacles.
Could not agree more.
Yeah.
We're 100,000% in agreement.
Now let's talk about something else. Okay, so I want to come to where we disagree and agree. So I think that I mean, listeners may not recognize, but you and I have some we don't agree on everything. I know, and for years we have sparred. We sparred on social media, and you know what? Actually, I guess I even though we've sparred, I respect the fact that a former dean, a dean of at the time you were still dean, a dean of Harvard Medical School would spar with somebody about the ideas. As somebody who was when we were sparring, I felt validated to some degree that you would spar with me. You view me as the kind of person whose ideas are so serious, worth taking seriously, that you, Jeff Flier Dean, will say you're wrong. So I actually admired that.
Yeah,
That's all right. So I'm appreciative the fact that Jeff Flier is going to argue with me. That's good for me. That means that my ideas are worth being argued with the dean of Harvard Medical. Right? Okay. So the things we always argued about were are legitimate differences of opinion, I think, on the role of the
mhm,
pharmaceutical industry and where that should be. And we recently
sure.
did a debate for that. Um, and so I just say that as background because I want to talk about the thing that kind of united us, which was, although we had our differences of opinion on this issue, And they're shaped by our different experiences. You as somebody who's tried to have these biotech companies and tried to push ideas in this way, and me by somebody who's watching what's going on in oncology, just different experiences we're coming to the table. Um,
Yeah.
COVID-19 hit, and suddenly our differences seem to pale in comparison to what we see as a commonality. So I wonder if we can talk about this a little bit. This thing, the thing that we see that unites us more than where we disagree. Um, and that is that we need to be in a place where we can vigorously debate ideas. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, I think it's a foundationally important fact that advancing in an intellectual realm where the view of where the ideas are critical, right, requires the back and forth of different ideas that will start out being in opposition or not in complete agreement, and then the various mechanisms are in place, from experimental methods to analytical thought methods, to like try to figure out better than was known before the interchange, what is true and what isn't, or what is closer to the truth, or what is more appropriate to take forward to the next step. So that's like a no-brainer. That's why I wanted to be in the world of academia, because that's the currency of academia as I understood it and as I want to understand it. And So that's the baseline. And then, I guess there have always been some issues that impinge on medicine and medical science where there are different views based on different values, where religion comes in, where, one's broad political perspective comes in. But it really became evident, over the initial reaction to the pandemic, where we have a massive threat, gets everybody's attention.
Yes.
There's inadequate data on almost every front.
Yes.
There are people who are viewed as experts, either because they are or because the media viewed them as experts.
Yes.
And they're being called upon in tribalistic news networks to
Yes.
offer their opinions. And this is all occurring at a time of a very complicated presidency of someone who,
Yes.
was loved by some, hated by many. And then all of the various issues that related to COVID and how to react to it and understand it became linked
Yes.
by many people to
Yes.
one political meta narrative or another. And I think you and I both began to see that at about the same time. And even though we had, had very minimal, direct interactions, we both said, "Do you think this is right, the way
Yeah.
this is happening?"
Yeah.
And we agreed that it wasn't. So that's how we came together to think about those issues.
I think, and this is a commentary that we wrote in Stat in very early April of 2020. And I think, I think you recently asked me, is there anything you would have changed about it? And I think we both agreed there's not a single
Yeah,
word we would have changed.
yeah,
And in some ways, I mean, I'm sad that this is the case, but in some ways it was quite prescient. I mean, it pointed out a few things that I think we've seen. As you point out, the threat was unprecedented. The response was also unprecedented.
right.
Unprecedented threat, unprecedented response. You want all hands on deck. You want every smart person at the table throwing out ideas, being devil's advocate. Let me find blind spots I didn't see. You want a vigorous academic discussion. And what you got fear, anxiety. And these emotions drive us towards base human instincts, which is not only you're not just wrong, you're bad. You're a bad person. You should stop talking. We should silence you. We should cut you off, let you out. You're out. You're good because you agree with what I think. You're good. You're on my team. You're on my side. Come on my table. And we got this really tribalism. One of the things we wrote in that article that turned out to be, I think, every week that went by in the Trump administration, and full disclosure, I think people can look at our tweets. Neither you nor I like this guy. Okay, so
Right. Not
right.
Like is an understatement.
Neither you nor I like this guy. Okay, but we also saw that every time he said something, there was the action and then the counteraction. It was his supporters, they both thought that was right, and some people opposed him just to oppose him because they don't like the guy. And again, I don't like the guy. I probably don't. I mean, my visceral feelings for the guy are powerful visceral feelings. But if he says open schools, and I actually think open schools is right, I'm going to agree with him just because, I try to stick with the issue. So one of the things we wrote was that there is a risk, I think something like there's a risk more toxic and dangerous than COVID-19, which is a huge threat. But the existential threat is that someday everything in science will be a matter of politics. If you are a Republican, you think it's good to drug this receptor. And if you're a Democrat, you think it's a bad idea to drug the receptor, right? To take it to the, right. So I wonder if you might talk about that. I mean, how has that idea played out over the last year? How do you think about the issue of intertwining science and politics?
Well, I think it's as horrible as it could be. And the sentence that we had in that stat article in April, has just gotten bigger and bigger in terms of its implications and the proof that it's what's driving so much discussion. I mean, even if politics wasn't as toxic as it is today, with the tribal separations where the acquisition of information comes in tribally, the efferent side of what you say is tribal. It tribally influences policy in all the ways that we see. That is the antithesis of academic approach. Even though, of course, you can look back in history and there have been violations of this going back from the first academic institutions. But the point is now it has become almost a driving force, and it makes it extremely difficult for people who have interesting ideas that may be different from narrative A or narrative B. It makes it difficult for them to even put forward those ideas in a public space.
Yes.
Why is that? Because they don't just get told why they're wrong. That would be fine if they were told why they're wrong. They get told that they're evil. They get told that they're that they shouldn't exist. And this is not an exaggeration. It is the way that it is. And it's not only over COVID, it's over some other issues as well. And my main, the way I've said it to myself and a few close friends and family recently is I'm on the fence. We're either close to going off the cliff to a point that will no longer be recognizable as a liberal society with humanism as its driving force. And I don't know what it's going to be replaced by. Or we're close to an inflection point where the great majority of people of goodwill who don't like these excesses will start to rise up together, be a little less afraid to say what they believe, and just duke it out in the world of ideas. That's where we are right now, in my view. And I'm putting a lot of my time and effort into finding ways to get us to that inflection point.
I think that's, a very important and laudable goal. And if I might just add, I think, we talked about how science and politics became intertwined, in part because this is such a polarizing figure. Anything he says, he touches it with his hand and it turns, it turns red, it turns Republican, But in addition to that, and the reason in part that so many middle of the road people are just dead quiet is the culture you alluded to. I don't know what people want to call it, and I'll avoid any labels. But I guess the culture I think that makes it very difficult is human beings. We do so many things from when we're born to when we die. So many deeds, small deeds. You can give somebody some change out of your pocket when you're walking down the street. You can help a medical student out. You can help somebody cross the road. You can raise a family as you've done. You can raise children. You can take care of your mother when she's sick. You can hold your father's hand when he dies. We do all these things. But we're in a cultural moment where a lifetime of things is suppressed by one wording, One
Yes.
tweet, 280
Right.
characters, a lifetime
Right.
of deeds is one is gone. The 280
Right.
characters is there. So, and I don't know what this is. It's an idea that you can have a referendum on another human being, a total referendum that says this person should be excommunicated, fired from their job and stay home and not participating, or suspended from their work, or no longer allowed
Yeah.
to participate on an editorial board or whatever, because of how they said one thing one day. When one, they may have misarticulated their own sentiment in their heart. Their heart may be in the place you want them to be. They just didn't word it right, because not all of us are
Yeah.
so good with words.
Yes.
Okay, so that's the and that cultural phenomenon that's in the zeitgeist. That is what keeps a lot of people who just want to say something like, "Look, I don't agree with everything this person says, but some of the things they say
Yeah.
have a point, and maybe we should
Yeah.
hear them out." And
Right.
people don't want to say that, because then they'll be, just guilt by association. Um,
Yeah.
so I guess the question I have for you is, I mean, I guess this is what you're working on. This is what you're trying to fix. This idea that we can define people in this moment. And I guess the question I have for you is, I remember the question. The question was this: you were dean of Harvard Medical School. There's no way you went your whole deanship without having to adjudicate a difficult somebody in your organization. Somebody did something and it was an issue. And I guess what I want to say is, I guess I'm curious,
Yeah.
what are the processes by which you would handle such an issue? How would you think about it, as a dean? I'm sure it has happened. And
Sure.
and what might we learn in the culture of social media from that process? How can we, make this process more fair, potentially?
Yeah, well, the social media process is the complete antithesis of what processes we
Yeah,
had as an
yeah,
organization.
yeah,
Because it's the completely bottom up. People, they have access to saying whatever they want to say, and then they walk away, and then other people read it and respond to it. I mean, that is not the kind of process. So, as the dean of Harvard Medical School, there's a bunch of different domains, obviously. So there was the whole area of misconduct.
yes.
Okay, so and we had a large, and still have, the school has a infrastructure of lawyers and experts who do nothing but hear of complaints or stories of misconduct of one kind or another, research misconduct or some other kind of misconduct. And there is a formal process for hearing about it, responding to it, informing the accused that they have been so accused. Uh, and then there are committees that are named to evaluate and obtain data. And there are criteria for doing that. And then it goes to several additional committees. And I can tell you, in the area of research misconduct, we have a full-time faculty of 12,000, at least when I left, that's what
Yeah,
it was.
yeah.
Uh, and, at any one time, there are dozens of cases that are in adjudication. And the dean is what they call the final decider.
Yes.
If it's someone who's directly employed by the medical school, the dean is the decider after a formal report is handed to the dean. And then if it's someone, the majority of the faculty are working at one of our hospitals or research institutes, and then it's the CEO of that plus the dean jointly make a conclusion
I see.
and inform the relevant people. Now,
Yeah.
a funny story, which I don't know, we may not have time for it,
No,
but
no,
I'll
please.
say
Yeah,
that very early in my career, I learned about this concept. Because
yeah.
if you want to go back and read an article that was in the front page of the New York Times magazine in 1981 or something
Okay.
like that,
Yeah.
it was the story of a person no longer alive named Philip Feelig, who had just been named to be the chair of medicine at Columbia.
Okay.
And to make a long story short, there was some research misconduct in his lab.
Yes.
And at that time, there were no formal processes. I was brought in. My arm was twisted. I was brought in to be the person to do the
You're
investigation.
the special prosecutor. Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
I
Yeah.
went, I took the train
Yeah.
down to
Yeah.
Yale. I
Yeah.
reviewed things. I wrote a report, and then there was an attempt to cover it up. And then it finally led to the firing of this individual, the
Wow.
senior professor, and the
Wow.
junior person who did the manipulation left the country and has never been seen again. Okay.
Wow. Yeah.
So, but I knew that at that point, there was no process.
Yes.
There was no authority. There was no nothing. And now I look today, there is, for a book that I've been working on,
Yes.
which is going to have a chapter on this.
Yes.
What's happened is it's gotten too complicated. Okay. So there was one very famous, you can read about it in the New York Times, case of research misconduct of a faculty member at Harvard Medical School that started my first year as dean in some fashion or other, and then ended up finally becoming a public story a couple of years after I left being dean.
Yeah.
So there was about a 7 or 8 year long
Too long.
investigation. It was too long.
Yeah.
And it became long because of the way the processes are set up and
Yes.
lawyers. And so anyway, I don't even remember what question I was, but then,
No.
oh yes,
how
you were
handle
asking
it,
me about processes.
Yes.
Okay. And there are some instances where things get done without process, and I will bring it up. A highly controversial case is a case at the University of Pittsburgh where there was an article written by a cardiologist. I won't say his name now, but people can look it up.
Yes.
It's in the news.
We've talked
media.
about it on this podcast. Yes.
Yeah. Well, that was a case where
over the weekend,
as best as I could tell, there was no process, no due process or even process. And I was shocked. I almost fell off my chair when I read about that, because that's not the way it should be.
So I guess, if I were to summarize a few things that you said that I think are salient, I think you're somebody who says, I think one of the things you said clearly is, to me, justice delayed is justice denied. So if you take 7 years or 8 years, that's too long. But on the flip side, 1 hour decisions are too capricious. That's not right either. There has to be, I don't know if people know this, but it's like, it's kind of obvious to me, which is, if you are writing an email and you're really angry, you're going to say some things you don't want to say. If you take 8 years to send the email, it's going to be obsolete, but you need to take a few days to at least calm down, and that's all you're saying, is that whatever process you have, it's got to be that right sweet spot where it's still timely, but the second thing you're saying, investigate. Yes, there can be all sorts of claims made from how somebody said something and what they may or may not have meant, how people felt about that, how people perceived that, what the tone was in that thing. And I think it's not so easy. It's not so easy to know what somebody said and what they meant, even if it's so simple as 30 people heard somebody say something. You got to talk to 30 people separately, and you got to make the people feel, not 30, but a few people, make them feel comfortable that they can tell you how they really felt about what was said, what was the tone of what was said, what might have been meant by it, et cetera, et cetera.
Let me just add one thing.
Yes.
One of the more toxic and dangerous and irrational things that is out there now is the idea that intent doesn't matter. It's only the effect on the recipient that matters. Now, of course, the effect on a recipient is important. It's not to be, made light of in any way, shape, or form. But in my understanding of human behavior and ethics and proper, society, a person's intent is very important to what it is that you hold them responsible for. And
I think it's the difference between murder and manslaughter. It's literally the intent, right? It's literally the intent. Yeah. Did you mean to kill them, or was it an accident? Yeah.
Exactly. So the problem is that intent is, it's not something you just read off the page, right? You have to use various kinds of judgments and to determine what the intent was.
Which is all the more reason, I think, for one, the investigation aspect. Two, taking into account someone's track record. Who is this person? What do they stand for? What have they done? What are their actions? Not judge them based on one moment, 1 second.
Of course. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So, I think we're on the same page. And I guess I would say, and then the last thing you're saying is the issue of the Pittsburgh issue, which I think is also a bungle. I think it's a bungle. It's a meta bungle. It's a bungle, on the issue of fairness to the person involved. It's a bungle. On the meta issue of actually advancing, I think, a legitimate dialogue and discussion, it's a bungle, because now everyone is intimidated from ever talking about the topic.
It's a suppression of the discussion.
You just killed everything.
If the discussion is one that will lead rational people to say, this is wrong for the following reasons, have the discussion, for God's sake.
So I think that's a meta bungle. But I think the issue in these cases is a leadership issue. The leader is capitulating to the
Yeah,
heat of the moment. And you know what? I mean, the people. I don't know. Being a leader, I know I can imagine being a leader puts a target on your back. I commiserate. It's not heavy as the head that wears the crown. I'm sure that's true in these organizations where petty
yes,
politics dominates. However, the one duty you have is that when people come to you and they're saying, get this person and throw them out of here, you have to say, you have to talk, you have to hear them out, obviously, and respect their point of
yeah,
view, but you can't just capitulate to them to save your own
yeah,
head.
yeah. Well, no, I think that that I completely agree with that. I
Yeah.
would say that my sense is that let's say compared to 10 years ago, the the likelihood that a leader,
Mm.
president, dean, any other, similar type position would be, quickly forced to do something that they didn't want to do
Yeah.
because of a crowd, it was much lower 10 years
Yeah.
ago
Yeah.
because they didn't have the crowds that they
Yeah.
have now. And what you see now is you have the politicization of certain points of view that a group will say this is the acceptable one, that one is not. That's You have to start with that. Then you have to have a group of activists. It can be relatively small who have access to a public media, Twitter, whatever,
Yeah.
and they make a declaration. It rapidly spreads,
Yeah.
including increasingly severe accusations
Yeah.
about the moral
Say it
persons.
again. You paused.
And
Yeah.
then
Moral character.
before more than a few minutes or hours or days are gone, the person is on the defensive, and they either have to cave, which many of them do, the majority from what I can see.
That's what I see.
uh,
Yeah.
yeah,
They cave. Yeah.
or they make a stand, where it's a rare thing. I know of a few instances
Yeah.
where people have done that
Yeah. Yeah.
and it has worked out. But it is, if you asked me today, would I want to, knowing what I know now,
Yeah.
and I was 15 years younger, would I want to be in the role that I
Yeah.
was in?
Yeah.
And I would really have to think about it,
Wow.
because I would think of it as, Jeff, if you're going to be true to yourself, you will come under attack on a
Yes. Very
number of
much so.
occasions,
Yeah.
and you may not survive. Is that
Yeah.
what you want to do?
Yeah.
Uh, I think that a lot of people are having those thoughts. And what it's going to do, it's going to shift at the margins the people who take those leadership jobs to people who aren't as worried about caving in. I mean, that's what it's going to come
Yeah.
down to.
Or
Will
or
that be
people
good for
who
our society? No.
or people who are although maybe good, they're not the best person for the job. I mean, that's the
Yeah,
other part.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That's terrific. I mean, I agree. I mean, I think that's important and needs to be said. Okay, the last thing I want to ask you, and I
Yeah.
gotta let you go. I know I'm over our time. You know, um, I admire your family. I'll tell you why. Your wife's on Twitter. I know one of your daughters is on Twitter, who I was a big, I am a big fan of. And and I admire your family because, and this is not just my feeling. I think people have literally told me they're like the Flier family. They like a good dialogue. They like a good discussion. You've argued with your daughter has pushed back on you, on Twitter. Your wife's pushed back on you. Um, you know, um, but it's never mean spirited. It's always it's always cordial. It's always from a place of respect. And it's always about trying to articulate the differences. So I guess I'm curious about I don't know. Did you intended to raise your kids that way so that you all can have a good, and what was dinner time like? I mean, are you guys arguing all the time? What is it?
uh, yeah, you know, I guess I'd like to have some videos of what some of my early dinners looked like, so
Uh-huh.
I could really say so with solidity to my
Yeah.
statement. But what I would say is, to be serious about it, is that I value ideas. I value interchange, and that's not just a made up thing. I do. My sign of respect for someone, whether it be a colleague or my wife or my daughter or one of my daughters or son-in-laws, is that I would like to know what you think, and I hope that you would like to know what I think.
Yeah.
And if we agree, that's great. It won't be that long a discussion, right? If we disagree, I'll be around to talk with you about it.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and I might even change my mind. So the idea that I have never changed my mind, is a silly thing. I've dramatically changed my views on many topics
Yes.
over the course of my career.
Yes, I can attest to that.
And I think
Yeah.
I've done that based on learning stuff
Yeah.
and realizing that something I might have thought 30 years ago, isn't as true as I thought then. So, the we have two daughters. One basically tends to think more like me. The other has different ideas, and I like them both. I love them both. They're both my daughters. They're
Yeah.
both great, and we have great discussions. My wife, Terry Morados Flier, is, she's had her own scientific career, but we've also collaborated. We've collaborated at a time when some people said, husband and wife shouldn't collaborate because it'll disadvantage one or
Right.
the other.
Mm-hmm.
And we understood what the arguments were and worked out pretty well for both of us. And we don't agree on everything, hardly everything. But we duke it out at the dinner table and elsewhere. So to me, that is, if you told me life would be just what it is now, except you couldn't really have discussions about important topics with people you disagree with, I might want to jump off a building at that point.
Yeah, no, I agree with you actually. And I would say my last thought, and then I'll give you the last word.
Yeah.
My last thought is there's a number of issues I feel really passionate about. I feel like I have looked into this issue deeply. I've read about it a lot. We've published papers on this issue. I feel super passionate about. I have my view on this issue. And I guess if I have two possible worlds, world A, by fiat, I get everything I want. The world runs the way I want it to run based on my understanding of things. And I just use brute force and power to carry out my wishes. I'm the dictator. Here it be. Okay. World 2, I don't get everything I want. I have to earn everything I get. I have to patiently find people, persuade them. I have to think about how can I get the fellows to think more like me, because some of these faculty, I can't change their mind. I have to earn every vote. Even if that means I don't get everything I want, I will always live in world 2 than world 1. I don't want what I want by fiat. I don't want it. I want to persuade the other person that I'm right. And I guess that to me is part of what's going on here, is that we think getting what you want is the answer. Getting what you want isn't the answer. It's persuading others, because when you persuade others, there's a risk that you will be persuaded the other way around. I've also had there's a few issues, maybe I can't never even talk about, but there's a few issues that I flipped a little bit. But there are a lot of issues that I'm just the same way I was when I was 22. So I guess that's what I'd say. I think it's more, as somebody who deals in the academy, it is more satisfying to change a mind than it is to get someone to be quiet. I think far more satisfying.
Well, look, I think we'd both be happier in world 2, and that's why we like each other.
Yeah.
And when the point comes that everything you say is something I could predict, I'll probably want to talk more with somebody else.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh, well said. Dr. Flier, thank you so much for your time. This is a real pleasure getting to chat with you. And I only regret that it took us so long to do it for the podcast. I think listeners will enjoy it.
Okay, fantastic. And look forward to many years of vigorous debate and interchange on many subjects.
Yes, and we'll have to revisit conflict of interest someday.
Yeah, well, that's one that I'm happy to engage on.
Sounds great. Great to see you.
Take care.